What's up, cool people? I'm Matt Conroy, and I went and saw Avengers Infinity War opening weekend. Barely opening weekend, but it was Sunday, so it still counts. Still the weekend. Still saw it opening weekend. Anyway, so I went and saw this movie, and I want to talk about it some, but I realize a lot of people still might be wanting to see it in the near future, so I'm going to try not to spoil anything. But I thought about something that I think I could safely talk about that this movie deals with that I can not spoil too much. So, basically what I want to go through in this video is kind of some of the moral dilemmas that are shown throughout the movie. And there are two in particular that stand out in my mind. There might be some others if you really think about it, but I just want to focus on these two in particular. The first one I think is going to be a little bit easier to explain, and that's why I'm going to start with it. So, one of the things that happens a few times throughout the movie is this idea, or kind of the question, basically, is it worth it to sacrifice one person for the sake of saving many? Most people, I think, at first glance, without really thinking about it too much, would say, yes, it is worth it. Especially if the one person being sacrificed, so to speak, is somebody that you don't know. Because what kind of attachment do you have to this person? You're just mathematically weighing one life versus many. Now, there are some people that, because the direct responsibility on their part, those people would say, no, it's not worth it because they don't want to carry that personal moral obligation. But I think many people, from all sorts of different backgrounds, would ultimately, especially if it's just random person for random people, would say, yes, it is worth it. Because, like I said, mathematically, it's subtracting one seems less significant than subtracting, say, 100,000. But the movie adds a little bit more of a wrinkle to this that makes it even more difficult for some people. And that the question then becomes, is it worth sacrificing somebody that you know, and potentially even a good friend or family member or somebody that's really close to you? Is it worth sacrificing that person to save many people? And I think there are still a fair number of people that would say yes to this, but I think what the movie does really well is kind of put some weight to the fact that it's someone you know, potentially even a close friend. There are some of the characters that kind of wind up saying, no, it's not worth it, we don't work like that. But then there are other characters that kind of think it through and say, well, you know what? If I don't do this, then a whole lot more is at risk. So there's kind of a balance struck in the movie between people who say it's not worth it and people who say it is. And so, I don't know, I kind of liked the way it dealt with that aspect of it. Personally, I gotta say, this is something that is not looked at very closely in terms of a Christian perspective. I think a lot of people just assume this is sort of a moralistic dilemma that doesn't really have anything to do with faith or the Bible, but ultimately, if you think about it, it has a lot to do with the Bible and with Christianity in particular, because ultimately the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross to save us from sin is that very dilemma. It's that very issue. God is saying, "Look, this is my son in whom I am well pleased." And yet, despite that, despite the intimate, almost incomprehensible relationship that we have between each other, in order to have freedom from sin, this sacrifice is worth it. I think if you're a Christian, you kind of have to say that, yes, one person is worth saving many. God made that very sacrifice. And so if we as Christians do not think that type of sacrifice is worthwhile, then I don't know. It seems like we might not be as fully devoted to God as we should be. So that kind of covers the first moral dilemma that I wanted to consider from this movie. The other one, I think, might be a little bit harder to explain. I'll have to say a little more to talk about what I mean with this, but there's another moral dilemma posed specifically by the villain, and he basically, his way of operating is that there are only finite resources, only so much stuff to go around, and there's only so much that living beings can do to spread those resources around. So the question that he kind of poses is, what kind of quality of life is worth actually living with? So, kind of to explain this a little bit more, I've kind of heard people discussing and talking about in recent years, kind of this idea that if you're not really living, I'm going to air quote really living because that's subjective. If you're not truly living, then is it really worth being alive? Something along those lines. Again, I think this is a far more subjective one, because what cutoff point do you say is the idea of truly living? Some people seem to think this relates more to the idea of taking risks and kind of living life your own way rather than just going through the motions or going along merely with what somebody else wants for your life. And that certainly could be a factor, but just getting more specifically into the movie, and again, this doesn't really spoil too much. This is just kind of the primary motivation, I guess, of the villain. And he basically says that because there are only so many resources to go around, his sort of solution to the problem is, well, let's just wipe out half the population. So then there are fewer people, and the resources can be used more abundantly by the people that are still living. And it's, like I said, this is a little bit more complex and subjective of a moral question, because kind of where do you draw the line? What's the cutoff point in your mind in terms of the type of life that's worth living? I mean, some people might think, if you're living in poverty and you're barely scraping by, that's not really a life worth living. Or some people might say that, if you're just busy all the time and you don't have any time to do something fun or really kind of focus on doing things for yourself, that's not really a life that's worth living. And there are so many different ways you could break this down. But I think specifically in terms of the movie's dilemma, when it comes to finite resources and that kind of stuff, I would like to think that it's possible. Typically, humanity, at least throughout history, seems to be quite good at, whenever we're sort of backed up against a wall, so to speak, and we, are having trouble living life a certain way, we seem to be really good at adapting and finding new ways of doing things, maybe finding other resources to use, or finding different ways to use those resources more efficiently, or different things like that. And so, in terms of the resource dilemma, at least, there's a reason the phrase renewable energy exists and different things like that. Because there are certain ways of doing things, especially of gaining energy, but there are ways of doing things where you don't have to have a net resource loss. Some of those things we have yet to find, but I would like to think that ultimately anything that's really worth doing, we can eventually find a way to do it in a renewable way that doesn't just keep eating up the finite resources that we have. I think kind of moral high ground, and especially the Christian faith, would say that, well, every life that can possibly be saved is worth saving, whether or not they're supposedly truly living up to a certain standard. Any person, any situation, there is possibility for change within that. And I think even that possibility alone is worth keeping people alive. There are some people who might say, well, because there are only so many resources to go around, maybe we should try and at least have some sort of population control a bit. Heck, China kind of does, or at least did, this, where, families were only allowed to have so many children, and I think maybe even certain male-female ratios as well. But again, yes, there are finite resources, but I would like to think there are ways to do what we need to do as a society without continually eating through all those resources. Now, of course, as technology advances, it seems to cause a new need for certain resources, and then we start using those up. But again, ultimately, we're obviously not there yet, but I think ultimately there should be renewable ways of doing just about anything that we really need to do to survive as humanity. So anyway, that pretty much covers all my thoughts on these particular moral questions. Like I said, there might be others from the movie. I just don't want to get into too much because I don't want to spoil anything within the movie. And I think just talking about those issues were pretty spoiler free. So anyway, if you got any thoughts related to either of these moral questions, any others that you encountered, or just anything else you want to say about the movie, leave a comment down below with your thoughts. And as always, like, share, subscribe, all that stuff. Just look down in the description and you'll see all the info on different ways to keep up and interact with my channel and my videos and all that kind of stuff. So that's going to do it. I hope you're all doing well, and hopefully I will see you next time. Stay cool, people.